Ed Bogan, former senior CIA officer with experience throughout the region. Ed, it's nice to have you here. Welcome.
Thanks, Suzanne. Really glad to be here.
I've mentioned this to others, and I will mention it to you. The speed, the surprise by what happened in Syria with these rebel groups essentially taking over the country in what it felt like a stalemate, to be honest, for more than 10 years. You always hope that there are some people who weren't surprised by it, considering that intelligence is also a business. But were you surprised, Ed, by what you saw, and what was concerning to you most as you saw these groups move in, understanding what's at stake in this region and just how complicated the region is?
Absolutely. I think I was definitely surprised by the speed and the intensity of the change. I think, we'll have a little bit of hindsight as we look back and analyze it after the fact and say, all right, what other factors are happening in the world that could have contributed to this? And, to some extent, I suspect, I look at Turkey. I look at Turkey's role in the region. It has an incredibly important role in the region, and it sits at a table with a lot of other dominant actors, including Russia, including the United States, including Israel. There's just overlapping equities and individual equities that are competing. And I look at Turkey here as potentially been probably more of a catalyst for what's taken place here than anything. And again, this is supposition on my part, but I look back at, and again, of course, we're American. I'm looking through an American prism. I'm looking at it through the prism of our administration changing in the near term, and thinking about Trump's first term and seeing foreign policy and national security policy that was often transactionally based, and watching how Turkey maneuvered in that space. And I think they were definitely not bashful about sort of expressing their interest in regions, whether it was Libya and Syria, Azerbaijan, Armenia, there's, northern Cyprus. And I think what you have is we're kind of in an in-between time between the administrations. And I suspect that there was more restraint on Turkey's side during the Biden administration with respect to kind of values-based leadership, multilateral agreements, and sort of making sure we maintain some sort of semblance of order on that. But given that we're in this transition phase to something that may look more transactional, I suspect Turkey kind of made some moves to be fairly aggressive to reset some things in their favor. Whether this entire outcome was the vision, I impossible for me to say, and even I don't know that that's the case at all. But once you sort of start a fire burns, and controlling that is an art, more art than science.
Yeah, which is why this whole business is so tricky. Ed, let me ask you, given the complicated nature of all of the different players that are involved in Syria, how important do you think the future of that country will be for the new administration, or how important should it be for the new administration?
Right. Well, I think it's quite important. And again, looking at it from the prism of the more dominant players that have had a stake in different aspects of the region, Iran's holdings and Iran's sort of arc is significantly diminished since Israel's response to the October 7th attacks, and most recently the last 6 months of operations that they've been conducting to really change so much of the region in their favor and against Iran's favor. This is a continuation of that, and I think someone like Erdogan's not going to miss an opportunity to see that as well. I think he has his own rivalries with Israel, and watching that take place. I mean, there's probably was a necessity to express Turkey's interests in here as well. So now, what does that mean for us? Obviously, Israel is an incredibly crucial partner for us, and making sure we can maintain Israel's equities. Turkey's a member of NATO, and Turkey has, it's easy to sort of poo-poo and say like this is a frenemy state because it's difficult to deal with, but this is real politics. This is the way the rest of the world works when we're not in sort of a values-based silo. And Erdogan is an important player, and Turkey's an important player, both in the region, but also in broader issues like the Russia-Ukraine war, and a range of other parts of the globe that have a wide array of sort of disruptive things happening in them right now. So having someone like Erdogan as a partner in NATO, and who's sort of, putting a significant, I would say, thumbprint on Syria's outcomes right now is something we absolutely have to pay very close attention to and see how the dust settles here. Now, looking at, HTS and who they are and, what this means, there's an awful lot of questions to answer about governance, about, what's going to happen to the various different, ethnic groups there. There's also the question of ISIS detainees being held, and what happens to them. And we're talking about tens of thousands, low tens of thousands. And this is highly concerning to say, okay, well, what does it mean? Like, what's the plan? And, are they going to get freed? And what's the implications of that? So many questions that we really need to pay attention to right now.
Yeah.
And of course, we're in an in-between time where we have a new team coming in, getting, transition briefings and having to understand sort of, okay, like we have an agenda, but there's also the rest of the world is happening. So how do we integrate that into our agenda right now? So there's a lot to be seen, and it's incredibly crucial for us.
I think it's interesting to look at some of the groups that Russia and Iran in particular have supported. Russia and Iran were both backing Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Iran has significantly backed off, I think, as you already mentioned, given the Israeli attacks on both Hamas and Hezbollah. They could have responded much more forcefully and chose not to. Russia could have responded and offered more support in Syria, but is pretty bogged down in this war in Ukraine right now. So let me ask you about that. We've seen protests on the streets of Georgia for nearly 2 weeks. There are calls of Russian influence throughout the region: Georgia, Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova, Ukraine, certainly. I want to ask you, in terms of sort of Russia's calculus here, what is the most important thing that Russia and Russian President Vladimir Putin can't afford to lose right now?
Yeah, I think they're very stretched, and what they can't afford to lose is the power of their information operations, because they seem to be incredible catalysts for setting conditions in their favor, or disrupting conditions that are against their favor, right? So it's a sort of double-edged sword. And Romania is interesting. Romania is very interesting because you have a constitutional court saying, hey, we're nullifying this election. We need to do this again. We have intelligence that identifies that there was an operation here to influence the outcome. And we had a fairly anomalous, surprising result. And we're going to effectively run this again. Now, let's see how that goes, because the information space is what it is. And it's heavily contested. It's heavily polluted. And it's heavily influential. And so this, to me, that was fascinating to see that a constitutional court said, "Hey, we're gonna stop this." Yeah. One of the things that I think we all see quite often is that our adversaries use our freedom kind of against us, and that's one space where it's effective, whether it's information operations online and influence operations. But then, what does it undermine? It undermines rule of law. Well, rule of law just came back and said in Romania, hey, let's make sure what we're doing here is actually legitimate. So to me, that's important, and it's an indicator of how stretched Russia is right now. Looking at something more tangibly than in the information space is looking at the naval base in Syria. Tartus is an incredibly important naval base for Russia. Several years ago, I knew it was the most heavily used port by Russian military ships outside of Russia. Particularly, that became particularly important after Cyprus banned Russian military ships from Limassol in 2022. And if they lose that port, which I would probably put money on it at this point that they're going to, that has incredible impact for them, because they use that not just for Syria operations, they use that for support to Libya operations. That's also, they're when they show a show of force in the Mediterranean, like this is central. I mean, it's where they refuel, it's where they getting food for the teams that are going to be on those ships for extended deployments. So there's a lot to watch in the Russia space right now. They're definitely under strain. We saw today the Syrian embassy in Moscow started flying the flag of the opposition, even though they also took Assad in, in the last 24 hours. And it's because is it some kind of compromise? Like they're obviously, having dialogue and trying to figure out almost certainly how do we keep our bases.
Yeah.
There's two bases, but the port's crucial.
That's a really interesting connection there that I haven't seen a lot of people make in terms of the ports and how Russia might be viewing the opportunities here. There's also a lot of risk as you look forward over the next let's say week or so. What are the key indicators that you're going to be looking for that the country might be going down one road or another?
So that's a great question. I'm curious to see any kind of policy preferences uttered by the incoming U.S. administration. I haven't seen that. I mean, there was a statement from President-elect yesterday where he talked a little bit about Syria, but I think something a little bit more on like the policy preferences, not so much commentary on what was taking place. Yeah. To me, that's going to be important, and I think we kind of need to see that now. Like I think that's kind of critical. The fate of TARDIS, I think, is crucial. It's a real indicator that if TARDIS falls, just how stretched Putin is. And if I had to throw a kind of a wild card into the mix, if there was any kind of operation, covert operation against some of those Russian ships that are in the Med, and I'm thinking of Ukrainians pulling something, Budanov pulling something out of his hat, so to speak, to do something pretty wild. That would be interesting as well. So just kind of keeping an eye on things like that. Yeah.
Budanov, of course, is Ukraine's, let's say, very talented and very creative intelligence. He's leading the intelligence division of Ukraine's military there. And all right, Ed, thank you so much for taking a couple minutes to help us kind of put this into context. Ed Bogan is former senior CIA officer. We're also very proud to say he's a Cipher Brief expert. We're going to continue checking in with you, Ed, to see how you're viewing things as they develop in the region. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Suzanne. Really happy to be here.